The ground that wouldn't stay still. Verlin, Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind of town you stumbled across. It was the kind of place you inherited, like a cracked mirror or an old family debt. Tucked between dense patches of pine forest and low hills that swallowed phone signals whole, Verlin hadn't changed much in 70 years, not because it refused to, but because it didn't know how. The roads in and out were winding and narrow, paved in the 1960s and forgotten shortly after. What passed for a town square was really just a loop around a shuttered general store, an ancient post office that closed 3 times a week, and a diner that still had a "No Outsiders After Dark" sign bolted behind the bar. No one called Verlin home unless they were born there, and even then, some didn't stay long. No one had spoken about the graveyard for decades, not because they'd run out of things to say, but because, in Verlin, memory had become dangerous. The trouble began in early April. A local construction crew had started clearing trees on the south edge of town for what was supposed to be a small real estate venture. 12 modern homes, a gated cul-de-sac, all backed by some out-of-town investor who never set foot in Verlin. The project was sold under the name Green Hollow Estates, a name that made the locals laugh in that bitter way they did when someone talked about paving over the woods. Everyone knew nothing grew on that land. Not really. The trees were brittle, the ground sour. Some said it was the water. Others, quieter ones, said it was the bones. On the 3rd day of excavation, the backhoe shovel struck something solid. Not rock, not pipe, bone. At first, they thought it was a deer. Common enough around there. But when they called in the sheriff, he took one look at the crumbling ribcage and ordered the site shut down. A few feet deeper, they found another body. Then another. Then 15 more. Unmarked. Unrecorded. Some with clothing still intact. Others little more than curled, darkened skeletons pressed into the soil like fossils. And here was the strangest thing. The bodies didn't match any records. Not Verlin's, not the county's, not the state's. No cemetery license, no burial permits. No missing persons reports that lined up with the dates the forensic team suggested. These people had been buried somewhere between 1902 and 1946, but officially they had never existed. By the time the 23rd body was uncovered, someone finally asked the question that should have been asked first. Was there ever a graveyard in Verlin? You'd expect there to be records. Old maps, newspaper clippings, family plots listed in dusty books. But all the usual sources turned up empty. Town Hall kept no archives beyond 1973, and even those had gaps. Whole weeks of meeting notes missing, incident reports sealed without reason, and permits redacted in thick, black ink like someone had tried to forget by force. It was then that Sheriff Halberd did something no one had done in decades. He visited the Sutter house. It sat at the edge of Verlin, hidden behind a curtain of evergreens that grew too tall, too quickly, as if they were trying to hide the building from the sky. It wasn't abandoned, not officially, but no one had lived there in years. Not since old Ruth Sutter died. They said she'd been the last keeper of the town's real history, the kind that never made it into books. Her granddaughter, Miriam, lived there now. Quiet, pale, and unfriendly, Miriam answered the door in silence and stared at the sheriff like she was looking through him. Halberd wasn't a man who spooked easy, but he admitted later he couldn't make eye contact with her for long. Her eyes were off. Not blank, not angry. Just wrong, like they were 2 seconds ahead of the conversation. She didn't invite him in. Instead, she handed him a box wrapped in old bedsheets and tied with twine. No explanation. Just one sentence. You've dug up what should have stayed fed. Inside the box were photographs. Dozens of them. Black and white, frayed at the edges. People in formal clothes standing in lines, their faces smeared or scratched out. Men with shovels. Children kneeling beside long, open trenches. And at the bottom, a map. Hand-drawn. yellowed, labeled in a spidery script that read, Verlin, 1907, Charter and Grounds, including the feeding rows. That was the first time anyone had seen the phrase, feeding rows. No one knew what it meant, but the map was unmistakable. Right where Green Hollow Estates was breaking ground, the old map showed a series of rectangles, 12 of them, arranged like garden beds. No markers, just notes. Row A through F, capacity, 36. When the map was compared to the site, it lined up perfectly. By the end of April, the count had reached 37 bodies. Some began to whisper it was a plague site. Others said it had been a dumping ground for a nearby asylum, though no one could name one. A few older residents, the kind who hadn't spoken more than a sentence in years, began appearing at town meetings, clutching rosaries and old letters, muttering about the promises and what had to be done back then. One woman, Estelle Hargreave, 92 and nearly blind, said it aloud during a public inquiry. Her voice was cracked but sharp. They were gifts, she said. That ground needed feeding. We didn't ask why. We just obeyed. When questioned later, she denied ever saying it, claimed she hadn't attended any meeting in months. Her family swore she'd been bedridden the entire week. And yet, video footage, grainy, black and white, recorded by an old security camera in the courthouse lobby, showed her walking into the building at exactly 3:44 p.m. She never walked out. She was found in her bed the next morning, cold, eyes open. The footage disappeared 2 days later. A local historian, Michael Wren, began documenting the finds and cross-referencing them with known events, but his notes became increasingly erratic. He started posting on obscure message boards, claiming the town itself was lying, that its foundations had been rewritten, that something beneath Verlin was alive. His last post was dated May 17th. It read, "They didn't bury them to forget. They buried them to keep something asleep. But it's waking now. I can hear it moving in the walls of this house. I think it remembers me." His home was found empty. Computer smashed. Floorboards torn up from beneath. No signs of struggle. No signs of him. Just a single handprint on the ceiling, pressed into the plaster. Too large for any man. By early June, the construction project was abandoned. The investors pulled out, citing safety concerns. The site was fenced off, then padlocked. But at night, lights were seen moving through the trees. Strange, flickering orbs that didn't match flashlights or lanterns. Sometimes voices were heard, low, singing voices, speaking in a language no one recognized. The sheriff stopped answering questions. His last public appearance was to announce a temporary suspension of all development in southern Verlin pending further investigation. He never mentioned the graveyard. Never mentioned the bodies. Because by then, even saying the word graveyard felt wrong. Like you were inviting something back. And yet, the ground didn't stay quiet. A week later, the town's water turned black for an hour. No explanation. Samples sent to labs came back labeled unidentifiable organic matter. No contaminants. No chemicals. Just something. A family driving through Verlin on a detour reported seeing a man standing in the middle of the road, his eyes missing, mouth sewn shut. When they turned around to help, he was gone. On July 1st, a sinkhole opened beneath the Verlin Elementary playground, 8 feet deep. Inside were bones. Not human. At least, not entirely. That night, Miriam Sutter lit a fire behind her grandmother's house. She sat in front of it for hours, unmoving. At midnight, she turned and faced the forest and said 6 words, recorded faintly by a neighbor's porch camera. "They'll never feed you again, Mother." Then she walked into the trees. She hasn't been seen since. And the ground. It still breathes. If you press your ear to it long enough, you'll hear them. The ones who were fed. The ones who remember. The whispering rows. The day after Miriam Sutter walked into the forest, the silence in Verlin changed. It wasn't that the town had ever been loud. Its quiet had always been its signature. But this was different. Heavier. The kind of silence that made your bones itch. Radios stopped working past certain streets. Dogs refused to go near the construction site, whining and clawing at their leashes. And children began drawing strange shapes in the dirt, patterns no one had taught them. Curving lines that spiraled inward. Rows of crooked rectangles. Mouths without faces. Pastor Willem, the oldest spiritual figure in Verlin, stepped down from his post without explanation. He left a note nailed to the chapel door. We broke the pact. There is no God in the roots. In the weeks following the sinkhole at the school, the town council tried desperately to regain control. They paid for new soil to be shipped in. Cement trucks arrived under cover of night. But whatever they poured into the playground cracked by morning. Grass refused to grow. The ground simply would not accept change. By mid-July, the whispers began. At first, people dismissed them as wind. Verlin sat in a valley, after all, and the forests were old and dense. But it wasn't just wind. The sounds came from the earth itself, low, rasping voices just beneath the surface. Some said they could make out words. Others claimed it wasn't language at all, but memory. An echo of screams caught between dirt and time. And always, the phrase returned. The feeding rose. It showed up in dreams. Scribbled in margins of notebooks by schoolchildren who didn't know what they were writing. Etched into fogged windows. Whispers muttered in the background of recorded phone calls. Voices that weren't there when the calls were made. The council brought in specialists, soil analysts, geologists, even a psychic under the radar. None stayed longer than 2 days. One, Dr. Elsie Crane, left in such a rush that she abandoned her rental car at the edge of town. Key still in the ignition, the driver's seat soaked in sweat. She emailed one report before disappearing altogether. It read, "The rows aren't graves. They're veins. And something is waking inside them." The box of photographs from Miriam's grandmother resurfaced in town hall after a night of missing evidence. No one had put it there. No one admitted touching it, but it had grown. Where before there were a few dozen pictures, now there were over 100. Some new, some older, some impossible. One image showed the construction site, but in the background was a figure standing by the tree line. Tall, unmoving, no face. Just a mouth, stitched shut by what looked like twine made of hair. Another showed children standing around a pit, hands clasped, eyes hollow. It was labeled Procession 1919. And another, perhaps the worst, showed what looked like the town square, but wrong. The buildings were burned out. The sky black. And on every wall, smeared in thick, dark lines, was that same phrase again. Feed the earth what was promised. It was Deputy Roland who made the mistake of digging further. A man not known for caution or belief in local legends, Roland decided to return to the excavation site alone with a flashlight and a recorder. His last transmission to the sheriff's office was brief. "I don't think these are graves. These are cells. Something's moving in." Then static. They found his body the next morning, lying flat on the soil. Not injured. Not disturbed. Eyes wide open, mouth filled with soil. There were no signs of trauma. No struggle. No fingerprints. Just his own recorder, placed gently on his chest. When they played it back, there was only one sound. Breathing. But not one breath. Hundreds. Maybe thousands, like the earth itself had lungs. That week, residents began leaving Verlin. Some in silence. Some in chaos. Others in denial, but all with the same feeling that something buried was no longer buried. That the pact, whatever it was, had been broken when the machines dug too deep, and the old rows had been disturbed. Old Sutter journals began to circulate, diaries written by Miriam's great-grandfather, who served as the town's unofficial undertaker from 1890 to 1934. The journals were weathered but legible. One entry stood out, dated October 17, 1908. They bring her the ones who won't be missed. No prayers. No names. Just stillness. We lay them in her rows, mouths filled with salt and ash, eyes painted shut. The earth feeds, and the fog stays back. If we stop, we starve. If we speak, we die. Another, written the night before he vanished. I saw her tonight, in the spaces between the trees. She's larger now. She knows we hesitate. The whispers have turned to weeping. That entry ended mid-sentence. By August, the forest surrounding the graveyard had grown thicker. Not slowly. Rapidly. Trees sprang up overnight. Aerial photos showed twisted canopies in the shape of a spiral, centered on the dig site. The ground cracked like old porcelain, thin fractures stretching outward across Verlin like veins on skin. 3 homes nearest the site collapsed without warning. No earthquake. No sinkhole. Just implosion. Their residents were never found. Inside, the only trace left behind was a thick black stain on the ceilings of each living room, always the ceiling. Town meetings became frantic, accusatory. A few claimed it was radiation or toxins. Others said it was a mass delusion. But beneath the arguments, a growing consensus formed. Something had always been there. And someone, once, had made a deal with it. It was the oldest family in Verlin, what remained of the Sutters, who finally told the truth. Or part of it. A handwritten letter appeared on the town church steps. No envelope. No name. Just a page yellowed with age and damp with dew. It was never a graveyard. Not at first. It was a mouth. A hunger that came from below. The founders built Verlin atop her teeth. She demanded tribute. They offered the forgotten. Drifters. Ill, broken. We called them the lost. But she knew. She counted. Every year, 12 bodies. 1 for each row. If the rows remained full, she slept. If not, she woke. We didn't bury to mourn. We buried to keep the surface safe. The document ended with coordinates. They pointed to an unused field behind the church, untouched for decades. A group of locals, against official orders, unearthed it by hand. No equipment. No permits. Just shovels and fear. They found bones. But not just human. Some were too large. Some too twisted. Some had teeth where teeth shouldn't be. And in the center of the field, they found a stone. Not carved. Not placed. Grown. Like it had forced its way up from below. It was warm to the touch. One boy who placed his ear against it began screaming. He couldn't describe what he heard, but he refused to sleep for days. When he did, he vanished from his room that night. The window was still locked from the inside. His bedsheets pulled tight into the shape of a spiral. By the end of August, Verlin had become something else. Something between a town and a warning. Power began to fail. Trees broke through sidewalks. Mail stopped arriving. Phones only dialed static past sunset. And the feeding rows. They began to shift. The soil pulsed at night. The fences around the site bent outward, like something underneath was pushing up. Something that had been promised a meal. And now, after nearly a century of starvation, it was ready to eat again. When the earth remembers your name, the problem with old towns isn't that they forget. It's that they pretend to. Pretend the screams were just wind. Pretend the missing never belonged. Pretend that the trees didn't lean in closer each year. Verlin wasn't dying. It was remembering. And when the earth begins to remember, it does so slowly, with the patience of something that doesn't need sleep, doesn't need light, and doesn't need permission. By the first week of September, Verlin had changed shape. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. You could feel it when you drove in. The air was heavier, like breathing through wool. Cars refused to start near the rows. Birds flew around the perimeter, but never over it. Time dragged slower near the southern edge of town. A 2-minute walk took 10. Watches ticked off beat. And worst of all, names began to go missing. It started subtly. A few townsfolk forgot the names of distant cousins. Then the pharmacist couldn't recall her own middle name. Soon, town records began to degrade. Marriage certificates, school rosters, voter rolls, all blurred. Not physically, just mentally. People looked at names they'd known for years and felt nothing, like they'd never seen them before. Even mothers stared blankly at their children's birth documents, unable to say aloud what they once shouted in joy. It wasn't mass amnesia, it was something worse. It was selective erasure. And whatever was beneath Verlin was doing the selecting. The phrase, "the ones who weren't missed," returned in whispers. Not out of cruelty, but recognition. That was the original pact. That's what the founders of Verlin had agreed to. Feed the earth, the forgotten, the nameless, the mourned by none. Because the earth, or what lived within it, didn't want bodies. It wanted the weight of silence. And now, as the rose awakened, it had begun taking names again. Records of the first 12 exhumed bodies were lost in a fire. An electrical short, they said. But the files weren't just burned. They were missing before the flames even touched them. Shelves empty. Drawers clean. It was as if the documents had never existed. And when forensic teams tried to recreate the findings from memory, they couldn't. They remembered the bones, the teeth, the arrangement, but not who had discovered them, or when, or what names they had tried assigning. Deputy Roland's grave was dug up in the night. No sign of forced entry. No tracks. His body was gone, and in its place was a twisted coil of roots, looped into the shape of a human spine. By the second week, it wasn't just the town suffering. People outside of Verlin, who had visited in the last 6 months, reported strange phenomena. One woman in Pittsburgh began waking up with soil in her bed. A college student in Scranton failed 4 classes because he could no longer remember dates, his own birthday included. An ex-pastor from Verlin, who had moved to Chicago in the 80s, was found dead in his apartment. Every photo in his home turned to face the wall, his nameplate pried from his mailbox. It wasn't just about feeding anymore. It was about reclaiming. The earth, or the thing inside it, was expanding its reach. Back in Verlin, a new player arrived. Not a local. Not a government official. Just a man with pale skin, a heavy coat, and a satchel full of old books. No one saw him enter. No one knew his name. But he walked with purpose, eyes always fixed on the tree line, like he was watching for something that hadn't yet stepped out. He checked into the Windmill Motel on the outskirts and left behind a single note at the front desk. If the land remembers your name, it can unmake you. Be forgettable. He was seen for the next 2 days walking the perimeter of the feeding rows, whispering to himself. On the third night, the front desk clerk found his room door open, lights off, and his satchel emptied onto the bed. The books were old, handwritten, and reeked of damp stone and rotting leaves. One was titled, "Sermons for Hollow Soil." The last page read, "She does not grow what she eats. She grows what she mourns." No one saw the man again, but his footsteps were found circling the graves. 12 perfect circles. Then nothing. As the days dragged into colder weather, a theory began to form among those who remained. The Sutter journals hinted at it. The field researchers, who hadn't yet vanished, muttered about it. It was madness, but the kind of madness that fit too well. That the feeding rows weren't graves. They were seeds. And the bodies, the sacrifices, weren't buried to be hidden. They were buried to nourish something. Something waiting to sprout. Something born of flesh and silence. It wasn't about appeasement. It was about gestation. Verlin, they began to suspect, had never been a town. It had been a womb. And the feeding rows weren't accidental. They were deliberate. 12 bodies per year. One per row. Layered like crop rotation. Patterns carved into the soil, remembered only by those too old to fear speaking aloud. An old man named Tobin Weaver, who hadn't left his attic in over 20 years, came down one morning and walked straight into the middle of the town square. He held a notebook filled with names. Names of the dead. Names of the missing. Names scratched out. He stood there for 27 minutes, unmoving. Then he screamed a name. Just one. Loud. Hoarse. Over and over. No one remembered who he said. Within an hour, Tobin had vanished. His clothes left in a neat pile beside the old statue of the town's founder. The notebook soaked with black water. Every name inside had melted off the page. A week later, the statue cracked at the base and collapsed. Inside the hollow foundation were bones. 13 of them, arranged in a circle. No markings. No explanation. Each had teeth that didn't match human anatomy. Around that time, strange growths began appearing near the rows. Not plants, not exactly. Not mushrooms either. Something in between. They grew fast, like tumors. Each was the size of a basketball and pulsed with a sickly green glow at night. When one was cut open, it oozed a thick, tar-like substance that smelled of seawater and rot. Inside was a single human tooth. Then two. Then a small, almost formed jawbone. The town stopped trying to document the growths. They were appearing faster than they could be removed. The remaining council members met in secret. There were only 5 now. They had read the letters. They had seen the footage. And they agreed. This wasn't just some buried horror. This was something bred into the land itself. A memory given flesh. They drafted a plan to seal the feeding rows permanently. Concrete, salt, and flame. But none of them made it to the site. One disappeared in his own home, found only as a wet outline on the carpet. Another was found miles outside Verlin, in a roadside chapel, with soil stuffed into his mouth and ears. The final 3 simply stopped speaking, sat in their homes, rocking in chairs, eyes wide, mouths trembling but silent, and from their lips leaked dirt. The last recording ever made in Verlin, by a local archivist named Jen Wallace, was a handheld audio tape made from her attic. You can hear her breathing, crying softly. Then, she says, I remembered something I shouldn't have. My grandmother said it once, before she died. Said she heard her name from beneath the garden. Said the earth whispered it every year on the same night. I thought she was mad. But now, there's a pause. Then a faint sound, like shifting gravel, like soil being turned. Then, it's whispering mine now. The tape ends there. And today, Verlin is gone. Maps show it. GPS marks it. But no roads lead there. No mail goes in or out. The town still exists on paper. But anyone who tries to reach it finds only forest. And quiet. And if you listen closely in that forest, past the trees that lean just a little too far in, and past the ground that always seems soft and damp, you'll hear the rose whispering. And if the earth remembers your name, it will whisper back. The 13th grave was never empty, even in the earliest sketches of Verlin. Those pencil-drawn plans nailed to rotting oak in the founding days. The rows were always 12. 12 neat lines of soil, each 33 feet in length, each equidistant. It was a sacred geometry of silence, a configuration kept by instinct more than law. And yet, there had always been a 13th, hidden, disguised, unacknowledged. But there, it wasn't until the church burned down that someone saw it. In the weeks after the final tape from Jen Wallace surfaced, Verlin fell into hush. The power grid sputtered out for good. Radios turned to static. The cell towers died. And still the ground pulsed, the trees leaned in, and the feeding rows whispered from beneath their thin crust of earth. Only a dozen people remained in the town now. Some too old to leave, some too guilty, and one, Mara Licht, who couldn't remember her own mother's name anymore. She was the one who found the 13th grave. It was under the chapel's foundation, or what was left of it. The fire had taken most of the structure in a single night. The stained glass melted into pools. The wooden crucifix burned so hot it left a perfect ash imprint on the floorboards before disintegrating. But beneath the altar, where the flames burned brightest, the soil refused to char. Mara had been drawn to the heat, even weeks later. She said she dreamed of a humming beneath her bones, of mouths beneath floorboards, of prayers being eaten. With her bare hands, she dug. And there it was. Not a grave like the others. Not a long row. This one was circular. Only 4 feet wide. Barely a hollow in the soil, but impossibly deep. When she dropped a stone into it, it never hit the bottom. Just fell, endlessly, swallowed by the dark. Around the edge were carvings. Not in any language she recognized. Not words at all, maybe. They looked more like instructions. A spiral with a line through it. A figure kneeling beside a larger figure with no face. Tree with hands. And below them all, what appeared to be a mouth. But not human. Wide. Too wide. With rows upon rows of thin, jagged teeth. That same day, Mara vanished. No screams. No struggle. Her boots were found beside the hole, placed neatly side by side. Inside one was her tongue. Still warm. Later, when they tried to fill in the 13th grave, the soil refused to stay. Shovels of dirt would slide in, but the moment backs were turned, the hole reopened. Wider each time. Photographs of the site showed distortions. Faces blurred. Trees bending away. In one photo, something appeared behind the hole. Tall, draped in roots, with limbs too thin and too many joints. The photo burned as soon as it was printed. Not caught fire. Burned. The paper blackened from the inside out, curling into ash in less than a second. The last 2 people to attempt entering the 13th grave directly were a pair of amateur researchers from out of town. One was an archaeologist. The other, his brother, a skeptic who thought the entire town had succumbed to mass hysteria. They arrived quietly, parked outside of town, walked in on foot with only backpacks and a recorder. Their last known message, recorded on a wind-up tape deck. We're standing over what looks like a sinkhole, maybe 30 feet wide now. Something's breathing down there. We can't explain it. It's rhythmic, like a heartbeat, but deep. The walls of the hole are moist, covered in root-like structures. The smell is, God, the smell is like copper, burned teeth. We're going in. The tape cuts to static for 13 minutes. Then, a whisper. One was never meant to stay buried. Neither man was ever found. Their gear was located a week later, scattered around the hole. Every item aged 100 years. Metal rusted. Plastic melted. The recorder was dust. And the 13th grave? Now 40 feet wide. It had begun to hum. Back in town, only 6 remained. The Sutters, fractured and trembling in their family home. A librarian named Kay, who hadn't spoken since her daughter forgot her name. And a drifter named Cashin, who claimed he was called here by something in his dreams. Cashin was the one who began to dig up the old blueprints. The first drafts of Verlin, scrawled on lambskin, sealed in the basement of Town Hall. They showed 13 graves. Always had. The 12th row was never the end. The 13th was drawn in red. Labeled Cradle. In the margins was a warning. Never speak her name. Never feed her memory. The moment you remember, she grows. Kay, too numb to feel fear anymore, whispered to herself. Then why did they bury the first? And that was the question. Because what they found next changed everything. Inside the old Sutter barn, long abandoned, locked with rusted chains, wrapped in barbed wire, they found a hatch beneath the floor. A cellar sealed with 6 iron bolts, each etched with a different symbol. An open eye, a cracked bell, a spoon, a circle split in half, a woman's face missing her mouth, and a spiral with a bleeding line through it. The Sutters said it hadn't been opened in generations, that no one living had ever been down there. But Kay insisted, said something was waiting, something that had never stopped waiting. They broke the locks one by one. Inside they found a stairwell, spiral, carved into the earth itself. No walls, just roots. The deeper they went, the wetter it got. The air turned thick, like breathing through mud. At the bottom, if it was a bottom, they found a room. No lights, no corners, just dirt, and at the center, a cradle, wooden, rocking slowly. Inside, not a baby, but a mass of hair, teeth, and a single name carved into the side. Verlin. The town had never been named for its founders. It was the founder, a child, a sacrifice, the first forgotten, and she had grown. That was the secret. The reason the 13th grave was never marked. Because it had never held a body. It held a beginning. The founders didn't build a town. They grew a monument to a buried god. The feeding rows were her ribs. The 13th grave was her navel. The town square, her heart. And every year they fed her until she slept. But now she was waking. The cradle cracked. The walls of the chamber shuddered. And from the roots, a sound. Not a cry, not a roar, but a giggle. Something ancient, something hungry, something that remembered every name you ever forgot. Back above ground, the feeding rows split open like wounds. The forest tore upward, and the earth opened its mouth. Not metaphor, not metaphor. The ground opened, and it whispered your name. The town that forgot it had a graveyard. They say nothing is truly dead in Verlin. Not the trees, not the names, not even the memories you thought you buried in your own mind. But by the time the ground opened, no one was prepared for the truth. It had always been watching. The dirt, the roots, the air itself, all of it had eyes. And now, it no longer needed to pretend. When the feeding rows split open, it wasn't like an earthquake. Earthquakes are sudden, sharp, and violent. This was slow, intentional. Like something had been waiting for the moment it would no longer have to be still. The ground peeled back in long, curling flaps, as if the skin of the earth had grown tired of hiding muscle and bone. What lay beneath wasn't just more dirt. It was layered, strata of flesh and memory. Bones arranged like scripture. Teeth lined up in patterns, too deliberate to be human. Symbols carved into the clay that glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing like a heartbeat. Every few feet, a human eye blinked from the mud, milky and wide, watching without seeing. Kay, the librarian, stood alone on the northern edge of the rows. She hadn't spoken since the night her daughter forgot her name. But now, words poured from her like water. She's here. She's always been here. And we've been living in her shadow. Her spine runs beneath the road. Her ribs curve through the woods. The creek is her bloodline. And now she wants to see us. No one asked who she was anymore. They knew. Verlin was not a town. Verlin was a womb. And what slept in the 13th grave had always been its child. But now, the child had grown. And the eyes in the soil blinked as one. Cashin, the drifter who came from nowhere, dropped to his knees and began clawing at the earth. Not out of fear, out of compulsion. He said the dirt was calling to him, asking to be read like a book. And when he tore into the clay with his bare hands, he found something. Not a body, not a bone, a face, perfectly preserved, pale, eyes wide open, mouth sewn shut with something that looked like sinew and hair. The face looked just like him, and yet it was smiling. Cashin screamed until his voice shredded in his throat. Then he ran. They found his body the next morning in the creek. Every inch of skin turned inside out, but his face, still smiling, still blinking, still whispering something beneath the water. Only Kay could hear it. She sees you. By now, the remaining townspeople had either fled or gone completely still. Not dead, not unconscious, just paused, as if whatever lived beneath the town had pressed a finger to time itself and said shh. The Sutters, the last of the founding family, locked themselves inside the church ruins. They had placed salt around the perimeter, burned their family ledgers, and tried praying. But prayer doesn't work when the thing you're praying to is listening from beneath your floorboards. On the second night of their vigil, the church bell rang. There was no bell. It had melted in the fire. But the sound echoed anyway, long, deep, and wrong. Like metal scraped against bone. Like a signal sent from beneath the crust of the world. The oldest Sutter, Evelyn, dropped dead where she stood. But her body didn't fall. It sank. Into the floorboards. Into the dirt. Without a trace. The others followed the next night. One by one, without fight, without sound, they sank. Like the earth was reclaiming them. The only one left was Kay. And she no longer feared. Because she had remembered. It started with a dream. A child's voice asking, "Do you want to see where I live?" Then the feeling of crawling on hands, on knees, through tunnels that pulsed with wet breath and smelled of rusted teeth. And then she saw it. The heart room. Deep beneath Verlin. Beneath the cradle. Beneath the church. Beneath the feeding rows. A cavern so vast it defied logic. Its walls were lined with spines. Its ceiling twitched with stretched skin. At the center was a beating heart the size of a house, wrapped in vines that looked like umbilical cords. And around it, walking slowly, were the forgotten. The ones who had vanished. The ones whose names no longer existed. They weren't dead. They were waiting. Waiting to be born again. Or something worse. Kay woke screaming, her mouth full of dirt, her eyes bleeding. But she understood. Verlin hadn't fed the earth. It had grown something. Every generation. Every offering. Every missing child. Every erased name. They weren't victims. They were nutrients. And now, whatever had sprouted was ready to emerge. But not into the world. The world was supposed to become it. The change began with the trees. Their bark peeled away to reveal eyes. Thousands of them. Their roots rose from the soil and walked. The air turned thick and coppery, like blood warming in your lungs. The sky above Verlin shifted from blue to a dark red mist, even in daylight. And at night, the stars stopped blinking, as if they were afraid. Radio towers in nearby towns picked up a frequency that sounded like sobbing. But when played backward, it was laughter. People began to forget the name Verlin. Not just mentally, but literally. Maps blurred. Files corrupted. Anyone who tried to say it found their tongues sticking to the roof of their mouth. Even the dead grew afraid. Graves in nearby cemeteries were found open. Not dug up. Opened. The corpses gone. Reclaimed. By what? No one could say. But Kay knew. She sat alone in the town library, the only building not touched by the growths. Not yet. The books around her were bleeding, black ink oozing from their spines, pooling on the floor like shadows. She held the last original record of the town charter, the one that named the founders, the one that explained the pact. And at the bottom, one final line, scrawled in blood-colored ink. Let her sleep, let her starve. For if she eats, she remembers. And if she remembers, the world will forget us all. Kay smiled. She finally understood what needed to be done. Not to fight it, but to feed it one last time. Herself. She tore out the page with her name, burned it, then walked barefoot to the 13th grave, which now spanned the entire southern half of Verlin. She stood at the edge and whispered, "Take me, but forget me." And the earth obliged. She sank. Slowly, peacefully. The soil closed around her like a mother's arms. And for one brief second, the town was silent again. But deep below, in the heart room, the child giggled once more. Because now, it remembered her. And that meant the birth could begin. The birth wasn't human. There was a sound in the air that had never existed before. Not wind, not thunder. Something slower. Something heavier. Like a lung inhaling the sky. It came from the dirt, the trees, the bones beneath the fields. And with it came the end of Verlin's silence. The birth had begun. But it wasn't a birth in the way we understand it. There was no womb, no mother in the human sense, no child with fingers or lungs or cries. It was older than those things, older than bodies. This was a memory being born into flesh, an idea that had incubated in dirt for generations, drawing life from blood and time and forgetting. And now it wanted to be remembered. It started with the buildings. The library, the last to fall, let out a scream so low it made the birds drop dead from the sky. Its roof curled upward like peeled skin. The windows wept dark fluid. The bricks shuddered, cracked, and sank as if the ground beneath it had inhaled. Where it once stood, a massive eye blinked open. Not an eye like a human's. No, this one had no whites, no iris. Just layers of translucent lids, blinking in a pattern too fast to track. The soil around it rippled with veins. Verlin was looking back. And what it saw, it didn't like. Survivors in nearby towns reported strange symptoms. Forgetting their own names mid-sentence, waking up with soil beneath their fingernails, or staring at the word Verlin on old maps and feeling physically sick. One woman clawed out her eyes after dreaming of a baby made of mirrors. A preacher in Tenpenny Hill burned himself alive, claiming he was the last mouth she couldn't close. It spread faster than fire. Not a plague. A memory. A memory with claws. Some said Verlin was never a place, that it was an infection that mimicked towns, planted among trees, and waited for just enough belief, just enough ritual, just enough sacrifice. But others knew the truth. It had been a place. Once. Long ago. Before the first settlers. Before the maps. Before even the trees. It had been a wound in the earth. A gash that bled dreams. The indigenous tribes never built near it. Animals refused to breed on its soil. Even time bent around its edges. And then someone buried a child there. No one knew her name, but something had heard it and remembered it. The 13th grave, now the size of a stadium, began to pulse. A dome of flesh rose slowly from the center, glistening with moisture, veins twitching just below the skin. As the ground heaved and screamed, bones erupted like white trees, skulls, femurs, rib cages, all twisting upward to form a structure. Cathedral made of the dead. Inside it, something moved. A figure, 7 feet tall, limbs too long, neck too thin, no face, just a smooth canvas of skin where eyes and mouth should have been. It didn't walk. It drifted. And where it passed, people forgot themselves, their names, their bodies, their language, their shape. They became unpersons, blurred shadows with empty mouths and weeping hands. They wandered toward the feeding rows, stood still at the edge, and stepped off, falling into the hunger without sound. The figure whispered in a voice that came from everywhere. You buried her in dirt, but you fed her in thought. You erased her name, but remembered the grave. You tried to forget, and in doing so, made her real. They called it the Cradleborn. And it wasn't alone. Every name ever forgotten in Verlin, the missing, the buried, the erased, rose as echoes. Not ghosts, not corpses, something in between. Faces flickering like film, bodies stitched from breath and rot. They gathered around the heart room, and they sang. A lullaby without melody, without words. Just vibration. Frequencies that shook glass in distant cities. Some said it sounded like a nursery rhyme in reverse. Others heard their mother's last breath. But to the thing beneath Verlin, it was music. And the birth reached its climax. The dome of flesh split open like fruit. From inside, something stepped out. Not walking, emerging. She was shaped like a child but scaled wrong. Head too big. Fingers too many. Skin like wet parchment, stretched over twigs. No eyes. Just a single vertical slit where a mouth might have been. And yet, she smiled. Not in joy, but in recognition. Because the world had finally remembered her. She took one breath, and the trees bowed. Took another, and the feeding rows turned to dust. And on the third, time inside Verlin stopped. Literally, clocks froze. Clouds halted mid-drift. Even the flies stopped buzzing. People caught in motion stayed in place, mouths half open, arms half raised. But their minds kept going. Inside their skulls, she spoke. I am not your god. I am not your devil. I am your guilt, your forgetting, your silence. You fed me with neglect. You raised me with doubt. You built my cradle from the names you never wrote down. Then, the world began to bleed. Not Verlin. The world. Satellite images showed a dark bloom spreading across the land from where Verlin used to be. Crops died in concentric circles. Rivers turned black. Birds flew into mountains, as if blinded by memory. Somewhere in South Carolina, a man remembered a child he abandoned. That night, his town disappeared. In Quebec, an old woman whispered her sister's name after 60 years. Her skin turned to bark, and she bloomed flowers from her lungs. Remembering now had a cost, and forgetting had made it worse. Back inside Verlin, what remained of it, Kay's name appeared on the feeding rows, carved into the soil itself. A thank you, a signature, a final offering. And the Cradleborn looked up, where no sky remained, only a dome of black, swirling like ink in water. And it smiled, because this wasn't the end. This was the birth canal, and we were all in it. The sky that forgot the stars. At 3:11 a.m., every telescope turned toward Verlin reported the same thing. Not a storm. Not an eclipse. Not a solar flare. The sky had simply vanished. Where stars once hung like pinpricks in velvet, there was only static. Like a bruise across the heavens. Blacker than night, and shifting, slowly, like it was breathing. The cosmos above Verlin had become a void. Not absence, but hunger. The Cradleborn had opened her eyes. Not on her face, she had none. But somewhere higher, wider. Somewhere in the thin space between reality and the thing that waits just behind it. People watching from miles away felt it. Not through their vision, but in their teeth. A slow vibration. Molar to jaw to spine. Like the world had been plugged into something vast and electric. And then came the forgetting. It spread outward from Verlin like infection in reverse. Names began to fade. Not from memory, from reality. Birth certificates blanked. School records wiped. Gravestones turned smooth. Whole family lines vanished from genealogy databases. One by one, people found themselves alone in rooms full of strangers who swore they'd never existed. Children disappeared from photographs. Pets refused to come indoors. And overhead, the sky whispered. Not words. Not yet. Just sound. A deep, warping groan that seemed to bend gravity itself. Birds fell from flight mid-air, not dead, just confused, unable to remember what wings were for. In Verlin, nothing remained but the cathedral of bone and the dome of what used to be skin. Now peeled open like rotten fruit, it stood as a monument to something older than sin. The Cradleborn did not move. She simply was. And where she stood, the world unraveled. The clock tower in Elmstead cracked from top to base, then began ticking backward. In Dunhill, water ran uphill. In a farm just outside Jackson, a scarecrow walked into the woods and never came back. Kay's name had sunk beneath the feeding rows now, fully digested. And in her place, another name appeared. No one could say it. Not because it was unspeakable, because it had never been learned. Not by mouths, only by forgetting. The town's last remaining structure, the old red house on Peller's Lane, began to laugh. Not creak, not groan. Laugh. The wall shook with giggles that sounded like a dozen children in unison, each voice missing something vital. No air behind them. No joy, just a sound that mocked the very idea of happiness. Inside, the walls bled calendar pages. Dates that never existed. Birthdays that never were. Anniversaries between people who never met. Time was hemorrhaging. And the Cradleborn began to walk. Her steps didn't break ground. They unmade it. Pavement turned to black sand. Grass curled in on itself. Street signs twisted, then sank like frightened animals. Every step erased more of what had once been real. And in her wake, things grew. But not life. Memories that never belonged to anyone. A wedding dress buried in the roots of a tree no one remembered planting. A child's drawing on the walls of a house long demolished. A piano playing in the middle of the forest. No player in sight, but the melody wrong, halting, reversed. The world was remembering things it had never lived. And above it all, the sky churned like a vast ocean of black oil. Astronomers called it the event horizon of memory. But that name didn't last long, because they forgot what they'd called it. And then they forgot it happened. Somehow, only the people farthest away felt it most. Those who had never heard of Verlin. They woke from nightmares where their mothers didn't know their names, where their hands were different, where their homes had extra doors, where something knocked every night from inside their closets, whispering, "You were supposed to feed me too." One by one, cities dimmed. Not blackouts. Blanks. Whole blocks reduced to white space on satellite images. Traffic cams catching only silence. And the void in the sky opened wider. Not down. Out. The shape of it no longer made sense. It had angles that didn't meet. Depth that went sideways. Light bent around it like it was being sucked into a throat. And then, the Cradleborn spoke. Not aloud. Not in thought. She became the voice. You made me by accident. You forgot me on purpose. And now I will teach the world what it is to never be known. People in 5 different countries dropped to their knees mid-step. Some wept. Some laughed. Others simply blinked and were gone. Not dead. Just unhappened. Erased in a way that left no gap. No memory. No ache. Their spaces filled with a hum of the void. Even the insects stopped. Even the oceans forgot their names. Tides froze. Mountains crumbled inward. The Cradleborn reached the edge of Verlin, which was no longer a town, but a wound. She stepped beyond it, and the land shivered, because her birth had never been about coming into this world. It had been about undoing the one that kept her out. One story at a time. One forgotten name at a time. Until everything remembered what it meant to be alone in the dark. And then, to forget even that. And then there was no Verlin. There is no ending to a story that never wanted to be told. Only erasure. Only the slow, aching silence that follows after the last breath of memory collapses inward like a dying star. And so we begin where all things end, with Verlin gone, not destroyed, not swallowed, just unacknowledged. It no longer appears on satellite imagery. It can't be found on any map, digital or historical. No roads lead to where it was. No records mention its name. Ask 1,000 people, and none will say they've ever heard of it. Even the people who once lived there, what few survived, have forgotten what they survived from. Their eyes twitch when you say V, but their mouths cannot shape the rest. A man in Idaho was found crying in the middle of a parking lot, clutching a child's shoelace. He said he didn't know where it came from, only that it shouldn't exist. A retired librarian in Oregon filled her entire house with newspaper clippings about places that vanished between editions. None of the articles mention Verlin, but they all feel like something is missing between the lines. And above them all, in a sky that no longer holds stars, the Cradleborn watches. She is not a god, not a monster, not a ghost. She is a memory given too much room to grow. And now she is something worse. A belief. Because people are beginning to feel her. Not in dreams. In moments. When the grocery store suddenly has one too many aisles. When the shadow on the staircase belongs to someone who died years ago. When a mother sings a lullaby she swears she never learned. One that ends with the words, "We buried her once, but she didn't stay." This is how she moves now. Through recognition. Not through names, but through absence. And the world is full of absences. Every forgotten grave, every sealed attic, every child whose name was whispered once and never again, she blooms there. Quietly. The Cradleborn is a seed, and forgetting is fertile soil. Verlin was just the first sprout. The cathedral of bone, long since consumed by the void, reappears in flashes. On road signs that flicker. In graffiti scratched beneath overpasses. In fevered dreams drawn in chalk by children who've never been taught to write. Always the same shape. A church with no door. A spire made of ribs. A bell that tolls backwards. And inside, a voice. You are not alone. You were never alone. We are all what you left behind, and people are starting to go missing. Not in the traditional sense. Their records go missing. Their images disappear from family photos. Their social media accounts deactivate themselves. Their names stop appearing in group chats. No one grieves them, because no one remembers they existed. Only the silence grows heavier. And in that silence, the Cradleborn walks. She no longer needs Verlin. Verlin was just the cocoon. Now the wings are spreading. Cities lose entire blocks overnight. Forest trails curve into places that aren't on Earth. Hospitals report patients who match no known human biology. And in the walls of those hospitals, children begin to hum. A song with no melody. Only hunger. The kind of hunger that doesn't eat flesh. It eats identity. History. Sense. It begins with, "What was her name again?" and ends with, "I don't think that town ever existed." But it did. It does. Just not in the way we understand. Because Verlin is no longer a location. It's a condition. A rot in the fabric of the real. A disease of remembering too late. A cancer fed by every orphan story and half-buried guilt. And it is spreading. It doesn't need believers. Only silence. Only the unspoken. Only the moments you flinch and say, let's not talk about that. The Cradleborn lives there. In the hush. In the pause. In the skipped chapter. In the attic no one opens. And when she moves through your house at night, you won't hear her. But your dreams will be dustier. Your reflection just a little slower. Your calendar one day shorter. Until one day, you find yourself standing at a place with no address. Where the trees grow in spirals. Where the wind sounds like laughter from beneath the dirt. Where the sky doesn't blink. And something stands waiting for you. Too tall. Too still. Smiling with no face. She'll ask if you remember her. And when you say no, she'll whisper, "That's how I know you do." You'll reach for your phone. It won't be there. You'll call for help. But no one ever taught you how to scream in reverse. And above it all, the last grave in Verlin will open again. Only this time, it won't be to receive. It will be to release. Because she wasn't the only one buried in silence. Just the first. The rest are waking. And they're hungry for your forgetting. So write it down. Say it out loud. Keep the story alive. Because every time it is lost, she grows. And somewhere, another town forgets it ever had a graveyard.